Thank you for that introduction, Laura, and it's a great pleasure and privilege to be here to speak for OPUS and on a subject that is very close to my heart, which is the Anthropocene. And in particular, I'm going to be speaking on the climate crisis, the climate and ecological emergency, as it is known. I had an idea that this talk would be on the role of protest in society. So maybe we can keep that thought in mind. But for me, it became a bit of a personal journey, so I hope you'll bear with me. And I've given my talk today the title of Memoirs of a Climate Activist. Okay, so I'll begin. As a young teenager, no older than Greta, when she first went on strike, I remember reading about the Kyoto Protocol in the news, or to give it its full name, the Kyoto Protocol of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the UNFCCC. It was signed at the third meeting of the Conference of Parties, COP3, in December 1997. There have been 23 COPs since Kyoto, 23 years of failure, or to put it another way, my entire adult life. I remember the first thing I did when I learned about the climate crisis back in 1997. I read the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC report. I needed to see for myself whether the things they were saying in the news were true or not. I was convinced by what I saw. Page after page of carefully reasoned arguments and scientific evidence. Feeling somewhat shocked, I did what I imagine most people do. Absolutely nothing. It wasn't that I didn't believe there was a problem. It's just that I believed, somewhat naively as it turned out, that someone else would fix it. I even had this crazy idea that the whole world would have to set aside their differences and work together. They would just have to. It turns out I was wrong. Over the next 10 years, I allowed the climate crisis to slip from my mind. Instead, I went to university, where I studied philosophy and politics. I fell in love, and I took way too many drugs. I lived in the moment, safe in the knowledge that our leaders had everything under control and that I didn't need to worry. Or so I thought. It was around the time of COP13 in Bali that I started to pay close attention once again to what our politicians have been doing about the climate. To my absolute horror, it appeared as though they hadn't actually been doing anything. I was astonished. I'd expected progress to be slow, but nonetheless, I had expected progress. If anything, it seemed as though we were going backwards on the climate. Whilst the governments of the world had procrastinated, the fossil fuel industry and its subsidiaries had been working overtime to convince the world there wasn't a problem at all. I began writing letters to my MP and the local press, signing petitions like a madman, and doing anything I could to raise awareness of the impending crisis. I started going on marches. In those days, they were organized by the Campaign Against Climate Change. And believe me, there is nothing more dispiriting than marching in London in December in sleet and hail with only a handful of other protesters for company and far too many placards. In those days, it was easy to despair for the fate of humanity, but life goes on. I finally married the love of my life. A year or two later, we had our first and only child. A conscientious decision based primarily on concerns about the strong correlation between human population, atmospheric carbon dioxide, and of course, global temperatures. I cannot imagine a greater sacrifice for my wife, who had always wanted to have 2 children. Anyway, time moves on, and so must this presentation. In October 2018, I remember reading in the Guardian newspaper of a declaration of rebellion by a group called Extinction Rebellion, or XR. I spat out my tea. Here was a group that was putting into practice the political philosophy I had studied some 15 years ago as an undergraduate student. A group that, up until that morning, I had never even heard of. Suddenly it all made sense. I knew what I needed to do. I joined the rebellion. Less than 2 weeks later, I took part in my first act of non-violent civil disobedience, NVDA, outside a government department in London. A few weeks later, we shut down 5 bridges over the River Thames. The movement was growing exponentially and the world was beginning to take notice. I'm proud to say that in late 2018 to 2019, I and a handful of others set up Extinction Rebellion Walden Forest, a local group that is still active to this day. In April 2019, XR staged its first international rebellion in London, during which time we shut down the entire city for almost 2 weeks. I was positioned at Marble Arch, a short walk from the iconic pink boat at Oxford Circus. Now everyone was talking about us, but more importantly, everyone was talking about the climate. And still we failed. We failed because carbon emissions, and therefore global temperatures, continued to rise. We are now at 1.1 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. We will not meet the 1.5 degrees target touted at Paris in 2015. Instead, the world is on course for a catastrophic 2.7 degrees warming. There is nothing to celebrate. I felt a growing sense of frustration during 2020 and into 21. The world had responded to the threat of COVID-19 in a way that it had never responded to the climate crisis. If only we could have harnessed some of that energy in the struggle to prevent climate chaos. Instead, many rebels felt we had little choice but to follow the science as we always had done. Instead of organising meetings and getting out onto the streets, we were forced to stay at home, save lives, and let the planet burn. By the middle of 2021, my relationships within XR Walden Forest had started to deteriorate. I was ready to start campaigning again, but felt there was considerable resistance to getting back out onto the streets from within the local group. I was, therefore, at a low ebb when I met Roger Hallam, co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, quite by chance at a demonstration in Parliament Square. He seemed meek, humble, and engaging, nothing at all like the man I'd read about in the news. He asked me if I could help him set up a meeting to discuss a new project he was working on. It was about insulation. I agreed to help, but little did I know that in less than 3 months, I would be blocking traffic on the M25 with a new climate activist group called Insulate Britain. Let's not forget that it was code red for humanity, according to a new report by the IPCC. And with the upcoming COP26 conference due to be held in Glasgow, the eyes of the world would be on the UK. I knew in my heart there would never be a better time to take action for the climate. The hard part would be asking my wife if she and my young daughter could live without me for 2 to 6 weeks, best estimate, as I risked arrest and a short stint behind bars. A few weeks after my chance meeting with Roger, I attended a birthday party in the local park with my daughter. It was a lovely occasion. The children were running around and playing and the adults were all getting along. There was party food and fizzy drinks and of course a birthday cake with 7 carefully positioned candles. After an hour or 2, it started to rain. No problem, we thought. It's just a little rain. We can't let rain stop play. But the rain grew heavier. Soon we were taking shelter under a wooden pagoda, kids and adults alike, all trying to stay dry. but the ground was becoming waterlogged and the party gear was at risk of becoming damaged. So the decision was made to abandon the party and we all raced home. Since our house was the closest, I invited a mother and her daughter to come round and dry off. I expected that by the time we'd all had a cup of tea, the rain would have passed and we'd be able to get on with our day. But the rain didn't stop. I watched anxiously as the road outside our house started to become a river. As soon as the water was in our garden, would the water rise high enough to reach our threshold and come into our home, I wondered. I kept my fears to myself and attempted to carry on as normal. Like any good parent, I didn't want the kids to worry. Eventually, the rain had eased off enough for our friends to leave. It was evening time, and thankfully, we had not been overwhelmed. I remember thinking to myself, perhaps I'd worried for nothing. I'm so preoccupied with the climate crisis. Perhaps I'd made more of this than was necessary. Nonetheless, my overriding feeling as I went to bed that night was one of relief. The next morning, messages started coming through on the phone. Is everyone okay? Did you survive the flood? It was then that I realized that other families in our area had not been so lucky. They had been flooded. They had lost everything and were now homeless. Anyway, after that, I found the conversation that I needed to have with my wife about joining Insulate Britain much easier. So Insulate Britain was a new climate activist group loosely associated with Extinction Rebellion that focused on using non-violent direct action to influence government policy. The group had one simple demand: that the UK government immediately promises to fully fund and take responsibility for the insulation of all social housing in Britain by 2025. The rationale was simple. Insulation would lift millions out of fuel poverty, save thousands of lives, and ease pressure on the NHS, whilst creating thousands of proper jobs and delivering pound for pound the best value return on investment with regards to energy efficiency. In summary, if the government really was serious about meeting its own legally binding carbon targets, it would already be insulating people's homes. Insulate Britain's tactics were very simple, but had never been tried before. We were going to block traffic on the motorways. It was an escalation of the traditional road blocking tactics used by Extinction Rebellion in city centres around the world. Except this time, there would be no singing, no dancing, no colourful flags or banners, no makeup, no costumes, no rousing speeches, just a handful of protesters and a concrete road and a lot of pollution and the great British public. The first blockades were deployed on the 13th of September 2021. I was one of around 75 activists forming one of 5 blockades that day. I was positioned on a roundabout between junction 30 and 31 of the M25, close to the Essex border. I remember the air was still crisp when we arrived at around 8 AM. We got into position by the side of the road and waited for the lights to turn red. And then we walked out in front of the traffic and unfurled our banners, Insulate Britain, before sitting down on the cold, hard road. I remember feeling a mixture of terror and excitement. We didn't know what sort of reaction we were going to get from the drivers, but we had prepared for violence. As it turned out, the drivers were calm for the most part. There may have been a few toots of the horn, but nothing too serious. We were able to speak to the drivers, hand out leaflets, and explain why we were there. Some were receptive to our message, but others kept their windows wound up and their engines running. A small protest at our protest. After 2 or 3 days of action, the attitude of the drivers had started to change. Some may have been understandably frustrated after repeated delays, but by then the influence of the right-wing tabloid press, radio shock jocks, and toxic social media had also had an impact. Of particular concern during later actions, I observed what I believed to be agents provocateurs, inciting ordinary members of the public to violence. The atmosphere had changed completely. I was dragged off the road just once. Even then, I felt empathy for the driver, who was about my age, height, and build. Okay, perhaps he was a little stronger, as he was able to pick me up fairly easily. I'd been well trained in non-violence, and so I didn't resist. But in that moment, I felt a visceral sensation of fear, from my fingertips to my toes. I was completely defenseless. The only thing that would save me, or so I thought, would be my ability to maintain emotional contact with him. I remember looking him in the eyes and saying, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." It was about all I could manage. Just then, something unexpected happened. Another driver appeared from nowhere and placed his body between mine and that of the first driver, saying, "Back off," to the first driver, and "I'm not going to let him hurt you," to me. He was a slight man compared to the first, but he was able to de-escalate the situation perfectly. I've never felt such overwhelming gratitude. I guess the story could have ended there, but for me, a more significant moment was yet to come that strengthened my conviction that we were on the right path. I regained my senses and shuffled back to the roadblock. Up ahead, I could see the first driver was now on the phone. I discerned that he was speaking to his family to let them know he'd been delayed. When he'd finished his call, I motioned him to come over. He gave me a quizzical look, but came over. "Do you need to see your daughter?" I asked. "Yes," he said. I advised him based on my previous experiences. "When the police come, they will shut down this road. Your best option is to go back the way you came." He looked at me again, the same quizzical look, and then he said, "Thanks." He disappeared down the road to try and organize the other drivers. I had hoped that the driver would have been successful, but regrettably, he was not. And when he returned, I felt so ashamed. I couldn't bear to look him in the eye. He approached me and crouched down so that he was now at my level. And then he said, "Do you know what? My sister's in Extinction Rebellion." I looked up and he was smiling. I sensed that he was trying to make peace with me, and we chatted for a while before I was arrested and taken away in the police van. I was arrested 5 times in 2 weeks, mainly for the non-recordable offence of obstruction of the highway, but also conspiracy to cause a public nuisance, of which I'm quite proud. Sadly, they could find no evidence of the latter. The hope was that the UK government would meet our demand for adequate home insulation, but we were fully prepared to be remanded in custody if they refused. We expected the authorities to lock us up in order to prevent us from blocking the roads again and again and again. We had planned to be behind bars during the COP26 talks in Glasgow, thus causing a major embarrassment for the UK government. But the UK government had other ideas. On the 21st of September, the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, effectively cancelled our right to protest by ordering the Highways Authority, National Highways, to take out a High Court order, a civil injunction against Insulate Britain. This highly irregular strategy denied us the right to be tried by a jury of our peers. Juries, it should be noted, are now much more likely to acquit climate protesters than convict. Instead, we would now be tried and sentenced by a judge. Furthermore, the sentences we faced had increased overnight from a relatively small fine, often in the region of £100, to an unlimited fine and up to 2 years in prison. The government was attempting to intimidate us, which meant we had to find new ways to stage our protest. A few days later, we pivoted away from the M25 and shut down the port of Dover. It was a glorious day out, but sadly, it would be my final action. I couldn't risk breaking the injunction with a young family at home. When I returned home from Dover, I found that National Highways had started placing conspicuous notices on my front door saying, "Very urgent. A package has been left that contains an order of the High Court. Read it immediately and seek legal advice." It was, of course, the injunction document upon which I was a named defendant. Nevertheless, I could see no reason for these notices to be placed on my door other than to tarnish my reputation and bring my household into disrepute. Further, to my absolute horror and disgust, I learned that my name and address had been included on the injunction document that had been published online. A highly irresponsible act when sections of the media were baying for our blood and inciting others to violence, placing my family at great risk while I was away from home. On the 11th of November, I visited the Royal Courts of Justice to speak to the judge about my treatment as a named defendant on the injunction document. I'm sure you all know the significance of that day, which is known as Remembrance Day here in the UK. Indeed, many of my group were wearing poppies as a sign of respect for our fallen soldiers. We were already in session at 11 a.m. and as it happened, I had just started speaking to the judge when an announcement was broadcast that we should now hold a minute's silence for the dead. After paying our respects, I took the opportunity to remind the judge that our boys had fought and died in World War II defending this country from the threat of fascism. I said they didn't die for this and labelled the prosecution a disgrace. There were gasps in the courtroom. It could not be denied that aside from the rhetoric, my logic was sound. Since the injunction notices had the potential to adversely impact upon my livelihood and well-being, I was being punished without having been found guilty of any crime and without ever having been offered a trial. Mercifully, the judge agreed and ordered the prosecution to make the necessary changes to its procedures. National Highways would not be allowed to place those stickers on my door anymore. In the weeks and months that followed, I found it difficult to return to ordinary life. I continued to identify strongly with the movement to the extent that it pained me to see my friends suffering on the roads or being vilified in the media. Nonetheless, I felt proud that I had done my duty as a responsible citizen of a democratic society. By the end of the campaign, Insulate Britain had attracted over 150 people to break the law, some of whom were sent to prison. And most importantly, we managed to get everyone talking about insulation. Before I finish, I'd like to explore some of the common criticisms that I levied towards protesters in general and Insulate Britain in particular. And please forgive the language. The two most insults you're likely to hear while on a protest are "get a job" and "wanker." I believe these two insults are related by unconscious dynamics. The first implies that the protester is unemployed and therefore an economic burden on society rather than a valuable contributor to society. This insult, of course, overlooks the fact that the vast majority of climate protesters do in fact have jobs or have retired after having had long and successful careers. The second insult implies that the protester is engaged in a masturbatory fantasy, detached from the reality of having to actually work for a living and therefore a waste of time. The implicit assumption is that the protester takes pleasure from indulging in a selfish act that has no productive outcome, or in other words, is of no economic benefit to society. The reality, of course, is the opposite. The protest is a selfless act of love that has the power to create a better world for all. Another common accusation is, "You're stopping ordinary people from getting to work." Well, of course, that's the point. We know that the only thing that matters to our government is the economy, They don't care about polar bears or melting ice caps, and they certainly don't care about social justice. They don't care that hundreds of thousands of ordinary people have to choose between heating their homes and eating. They only care about tax receipts, so we hit them where it hurts. You're pissing off the people you need to support you, is another accusation. This is an unfortunate consequence of engaging in direct action. The idea that some people are more deserving of protest than others is problematic from a purely psychological point of view. If we allow ourselves to denigrate certain individuals, such as Johnson, Trump, or Bolsonaro, then we may struggle to hold in mind those aspects of systemic injustice in which we ourselves are implicated and have the power to address. Why don't you protest outside of Parliament? Is a common suggestion. It sounds like a sensible idea, and indeed it would be if politicians cared about appealing to anyone other than their own party and core voters. They do not. I have attended many mass demonstrations in Parliament Square that have been completely ignored by the government. Why don't you protest outside the Chinese embassy? Is a racist variation on the theme. It's a way of splitting and projecting responsibility for the climate crisis from ourselves and onto others, who we can then denigrate. Of course, Chinese carbon emissions are off the chart, but look a little closer. Chinese per capita emissions, i.e. per person emissions, are half that of American, USA, per capita emissions. And by the way, doesn't China manufacture all of our consumer products? The fact of the matter is, no matter where you choose to stage a protest, the response will always be the same. Why don't you do it somewhere else? It's a sort of protest NIMBYism, i.e. not in my backyard. Sure, protest is a good thing in principle, just as long as it doesn't affect me. It is important to acknowledge that protest evokes persecutory anxieties. This is understandable, given that the role of protest is to be critical of society, or at least some aspect of society. Yet the degree of persecutory anxiety felt by ordinary people is concerning. I believe we are suffering from a failure of containment in society, notably from our politicians, who are only interested in taking care of themselves, and the mainstream media, which creates divisions and fosters animosity. A common line of attack from the media is to ask members of Insulate Britain whether their homes are insulated. If not, we are accused of being hypocrites. Why don't you insulate your own home instead of demanding that the government does it for you? These types of retaliatory attacks spectacularly miss the point. They are typical of the neoliberal mindset that is leading us to destruction. Our survival depends not upon individuals taking action, but on mass social action, ideally led by the government. Finally, I'd like to say a few words about those criticisms that are fixated on ambulances and the blocking of emergency services. I have never been involved in any protest that failed to let an emergency vehicle through when it had its blue lights flashing. I believe an attempt was made to slander Insulate Britain based on very dubious evidence. My view is this: if the Daily Mail couldn't turn it into a national scandal, it probably didn't happen. So a few concluding thoughts. It is 1 minute to midnight in the struggle to prevent climate catastrophe. The consequences of failure are unimaginable. Blind faith will not save us from annihilation. The continued survival of all life on Earth is too important to leave to chance. We have the power to stop all of this. We have the responsibility to stop all of this. I don't believe in miracles. I believe in hard work and personal sacrifice. After all, the climate crisis is not going to resolve itself. We don't have time to wait for a perfect solution. We don't have time to argue amongst ourselves. There are no points for participation. The only thing that matters is winning. This is the struggle of our lifetimes. We will not get another chance. Thank you. So I'll let you have a moment, and we can open up the discussion. I'm very interested to hear your thoughts.
A first reaction I had at the very beginning of your talk was you described this as your memoir, and I was thinking, what? That means you're done. You're not doing this anymore. Come on, you need to. But then I thought, why am I talking to you? I mean, I need to think about more, you know, what I might need to do.
It's a little bit fanciful. But yeah, you're right. The work is not done.
I think I'm with Ray. What you've made me think is what I need to do personally.
In terms of what we might need to do personally, Rob, I'm wondering how has Extinction Resistance, Insulate Britain, how have you connected with other social justice organizations, for example, anti-racist groups or other such other such people and interests?
It's an interesting question, Ray. It's been a massive conversation within Extinction Rebellion about how we do that, and even whether we should do that, of all honesty. Extinction Rebellion was very focused on the task at hand, which was the climate and ecological emergency, and we had 3 very clear demands. And there's been a big debate about whether we should add a 4th demand, which is about social justice specifically. And my perspective has always been, if you look at the information that has always been there from the outset, social justice has always been integral to what we do, because we're looking at toxic systems and how we can address those and make things better for everyone. But again, there was this debate that we needed to do more, you know? We needed to make that front and center, you know? And so now there is very much, you know, I'd say the culture within Extinction Rebellion has changed, shifted, even in a very short space of time. XR Unify is actively engaging with other groups, unifying with other groups, and many of the campaigns that you'll see at at local level are conducted in this collaborative way. So we have a campaign to stop the Edmonton incinerator, and we're going to the people of Edmonton. We're working with Black Lives Matter and various groups, because it's an issue that disproportionately affects people of color. So we're trying to work with the different communities. And so we have something called the movement of movements now. We're trying to sort of, instead of us, you know, viewing ourselves here and then everybody else can follow, we're kind of trying to reposition it so it's more equal on that kind of level on that basis. It's been really hard. It's been really, really hard. And I think Extinction Rebellion was in danger of going under the weight of this, in these negotiations. And I hope that we're through the other side now and we're stronger because of it. But, you know, it's a massive area.
When you say it's been really hard, are you speaking to some resistance that you experience with other groups, you know, wanting to connect and work with you?
There's lots of theoretical issues, as well as intergroup, interpersonal issues. So ideologically, for instance, if we as Extinction Rebellion view ourselves as participants of a toxic system, and we recognize others as being equally part of that toxic system, and the point is that we try not to judge anybody, and that included not judging the police. And of course, this was a massive bone of contention with communities of color. And so I remember singing songs to the police in 2009 to 2018, 2019, which is, "We love you. We're doing this for your children too." And for me, it was the most glorious expression of, you know, we're all in this together. The climate crisis affects everybody. But we encountered a lot of resistance to that, understandably. And so we've moved away as a movement. You know, that's now shunned upon. You don't sing to the police. So I have my feelings about that, but, you know, I viewed it from a purely psychological perspective in terms of the work that I do, you know, psychedelic conscious, in-group, out-group, whatever, you know. But we have to adapt, we have to respond. And I hope that, you know, the change of approach is successful, and that we do bring more people with us to the next march. But it's not, and you know, I was going to say, it's not an easy thing, because it's not a case of saying, you know, oh, this person's right and that person's wrong. It's just different ways of looking at things.
I strongly agree with your point about being positive towards the policeman. I can't see how portraying them as an enemy is going to help anybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's almost a subject that I don't want to get into, you know, because it's a contentious subject. But I think when we talk about splitting and projection, you know, and demonizing certain sections of society, you know, I strongly agree, Richard, that we need to try and work with everybody, like even our worst enemy. We had Boris Johnson's father, I forget his name, Stanley Johnson. He came to one of our Extinction Rebellion rallies, you know, and we had him up on the stage and we were talking to him, you know. We said, we'll speak to anyone. Because we're not, you know, we don't believe that there's bad people. We believe that, you know, people, they take different paths in life, and, you know, they're all, like I say, they're all sort of subject to the same processes that we're subject to. You know, they might experience something slightly differently, and that takes them in a different direction, but we're all in this together, as it were. It's incredibly complicated.
I was very moved, Rob, by everything you said, but parts in particular, and I guess I was really, what's really stayed with me, I suppose, with two things very different. One was the, you know, your description of the sort of, you know, projection, the kind of unwanted parts of ourselves that we can, you know, we so easily give to others. When you talked about the terms that were used towards you, and then sat alongside quite quickly this intensely moving description of this moment of human connection. And yeah, I don't know what else to say about that other than it's something about that moment that felt really potentially transformational, and how that is so full of potential if we can have those moments of connection, and how hard it feels to do that in life, never mind on this topic, I suppose. And you know, your comments about mainstream politics, certainly in this country, which is all I can claim to know about, and mainstream media, which, you know, I have to be honest, leaves me feeling hopeless, actually, and how we can bear to engage in that, because it just feels so unbearably impossible. And I really like what you said about the sort of mass social action being what we need, and this sort of very convenient locating the change in individuals. And but gosh, yeah, anyway, just very, very interesting and moving. And the connection I made in my mind as a conversation, I think I've been to a few OPUS conferences now, and we come back, I think, to this painful position of thinking and doing. And we often talk about, you know, and I'm very mindful of who comes to these conferences, who we are, and sitting around thinking together, and it can feel problematic. And so it's been really refreshing for me to hear something about this action and this doing with a great deal of thinking embedded in that. And I found that really rewarding. So thank you for sharing that. So I was slightly rambling, but I was trying to just be a bit in the moment and share what was going on for me.
Thank you, Laura. I think that's perhaps my motivation for being here and doing this. You know, it is, I think it's very important for me to have both of those aspects of thinking and doing.
Mm.
Often we get stuck in one mode or another. And I think if I can say something about OPUS as an organization, and, you know, the typical OPUS person, and if I could say that without being too unkind and without being too, you know, homogenous in my approach, you know, but we do have a tendency to do a lot of thinking. And I think there's an idealization of the depressive position, where we look at all the different options and we see all the different options. And in my mind, that's always been, yeah, well, you can look at all the different options, but then you do have to get off the fence. So I'm quite comfortable with the idea that I'll jump off the fence and I'll jump straight into the paranoid schizoid position. Then it's on me to try and find my way back again. I have to have confidence and courage to know that I might not get it right, actually. I might get it wrong. And then I have to deal with the consequences and deal with the, you know, the shame and the regret and everything else that comes with it. And trust that, you know, reparations can be made. I'll find my way back to the depressive position and then I'll do it all over again. Otherwise, what's the point? We're just going to talk about everything and not get anything done. But to your earlier point, it was important to me, you know, to make that connection with the person on the road. And it's happened so many times over the course of my activism. When you meet people on the streets, you have a good conversation, you can change minds, you can change hearts and minds. Then what I find problematic is, how do we replicate that on a national or an international scale? Because as soon as you put the news, you put the media, you put social media in between, and you've lost that connection. It becomes, well, it becomes media. It becomes something to be consumed. So in a way, that kind of breaks my heart to know that on the road I can have these experiences, but know that it's going to get so distorted by the time it reaches the wider public that it's outside of my control. It's another problem. I'm interested to hear the thoughts of maybe some of the people that haven't spoken.
I was just thinking what you were saying about the doing, not the thinking. And I think that's why I chose to come, to this workshop to hear about, that the sort of action, not just the more thinking. You also used the word brave, and I had been thinking as I was listening to I really appreciated your really open discussion about your process in this too. And I was thinking how brave you are, and I know of a member of XR who's in his 80s who has glued himself to things, and people are doing extraordinary brave things, which I don't feel able to do. And thinking about what gets in the way. I was also thinking about what you represent for people, because anything I've heard in the press, particularly this group, is so vilified. And the actions that you're taking might be alongside a news report about the need to insulate people's homes, and how these two things cannot be put together. Mm-hmm. And it's though we've got to live with the passivity and just be so angry about those that are trying to make it happen, which is really hard to make sense of sometimes.
Yeah. And it's that type of, this is the thing, is we do these actions and we learn so much, and stuff that we didn't even realize we were going to learn about. So, I was talking about the breakdown of containment, the failure of containment in society. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the news has such an important role. It could be helping us to make sense of what's happening in the world, but it doesn't. It does the opposite. It makes it more difficult to understand what's happening in the world. We get information, but we don't get any kind of sense. So that's not a problem that just affects me, or what I'm doing, because I feel misunderstood or something like this. I'm lamenting the loss of, thinking capacity in our institutions, such as media agencies, but also our governments. And there's been a lot of institutions come under attack from this neoliberal ideology, and people are under more pressure now, and so they don't have time to think. And they have to fill out reports, but no one knows where the reports go. Have to tick boxes. They have to, everything's being marketized at the moment, or monetized. So there's plenty of avenues that we could go down where we could help people to think. Think about supervision groups if you work in, a psychodynamic kind of world, or think about, doctors and how they benefited from, new junior doctors would benefit from learning and being around the older doctors. And then of course you get the neoliberal ideology comes in, and then the older doctors are got rid of, early retirement because they're too expensive. You lose all that knowledge and wisdom. So there's all kinds of ways in which we destroy the spaces. And I think we had more in the past. And maybe we've got, maybe they do exist now, like OPUS is a space where we can come together and think and try and make sense of things, and we can benefit from each other's wisdom. But my feeling is that there's not enough. And that, I feel like we're in the minority doing this. And then you get the likes of the Sun newspaper, which has the biggest distribution of all. And it's one of the worst, if not the worst. I think the Daily Mail is probably the worst, but the Sun is massive, and that's not helping anyone to think.
Have you tried working with journalists from the Sun and the Daily Mail.
Yeah, part of the Insulate Britain campaign, we were working specifically with the tabloid press because we wanted to reach that wider audience. And my overriding memory of of that is one morning we turned up ready to do our block, and the Daily Mail journalists were there. We had invited them, and I volunteered to give them some words, you know, a little bit of a press release, and they weren't interested. They you know, the guy didn't even get his notebook out, but he did say, "Oh, the police, you know, the police are already here. You know, they know that you're coming." I was like, "Oh well, I guess you'll get the photographs your readers want then, won't you?" They're like sort of looking all shifty and shuffling around, and it's like, nothing to do with me, mate. No, they're awful. And I mentioned, you weren't here, Jonathan, but I mentioned agent provocateurs, agent provocateurs, you know, that I firmly believe the media send out in order to create the headlines. And that's based on my experience on the streets. You see like these people creating a fuss and their photos on the front page the next day. These are not ordinary members of the public. There was one guy, you know, he was heckling. I went to engage him, and he was on his way to his office, so he walked off, you know. And then he was back again an hour later. I'd already left by this stage, but he was back. And he was in the press as well. I thought, what? He's just been told to come back and, you know, get a story. There's too many strange things happening for me to think that it's all just a coincidence. I think we do have a taboo against being arrested. And I think once you break that taboo, it becomes a lot easier. And I think it's harder for certain people, you know, when they're younger and they're working and they're thinking about their careers and they're worried about, you know, the potential fallout later on. But most of the people that I go on the streets with are much, much older than myself. And they, you know, they've made that decision that that's how they want to, that's what they want to do. That's how they want to spend their time. There's one guy from Extinction Rebellion, Hackney. I often see him out on the streets, an older gentleman. And he had a placard that he made himself. Said, "I'm here." He said, "I'm here." I think it just said something like, "I'm here because I want to be able to look my granddaughter in the eye." And I felt so much love for him, so much respect, and I thanked him. I went up to him and I said, "Look, I'm really grateful for you being here. I really appreciate that." But that guy was a regular, like he was out every week. So no, there are lots of amazing people. The best people I've ever met are out on the streets, you know. And there's a few like crazy people as well, but the vast majority are very, very intelligent people who really sort of got their heads screwed on. So I'd recommend it. I noticed that we're a minute to the hour, so I guess we better wrap things up. And I just want to thank you all for being here, and thank you, Laura, for that introduction. I was very grateful for. And
Thank you, Rob.
perfect.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for a fantastic session. Really, really great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll close the room. Thank you again.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Enjoy the
Take
rest of the
care. Bye, everyone.
Bye.